This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The light in Positano had a way of turning everything to honey in the last hour before sunset, and Beatrice Hartwell would remember that light for the rest of her life, long after she'd forgotten the name of the cafe where she'd first seen him. She was 22 that summer, on a fellowship from her university's art conservation program, spending 8 weeks learning to clean 400-year-old varnish off canvases in a workshop that smelled of turpentine and dust. She hadn't come to Italy looking for anything except technique and solitude. She found neither. He was sitting alone at the cafe, 2 tables from hers, a paperback novel open in front of him that he wasn't reading. She noticed that first. The stillness of a man pretending to be absorbed in something he wasn't. He had dark hair pushed back, like he hadn't bothered with it that morning, a jaw that looked like it had been drawn with a ruler, and eyes so deep a brown they read as black from across the room. He wore a plain linen shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, nothing that announced money, though something about the way he held his shoulders, squared, alert, like a man who'd been taught to always know where the exits were, made her look twice. "You're staring," he said, without looking up from his book. Her face went hot. "I wasn't." "You were. It's fine. I was staring first." Now he looked up, and the directness of his gaze nearly knocked the breath out of her. "You have paint on your hands." She glanced down. Cadmium yellow, dried into the creases of her knuckles, refusing every solvent she'd tried. "Occupational hazard." "What's the occupation?" "Restoration. I'm here for the summer, working on a Caravaggio school piece that's falling apart at the seams." She didn't know why she was telling a stranger this. Something about him made silence feel like a waste. "You?" A pause, brief enough that she almost missed it. "Student," he said. "Economics. Boring, mostly." It was, she would learn many years later, the first lie he ever told her, and the only one that mattered. His name was Luca. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't ask for one, because in the particular magic of that summer, last names felt unnecessary, almost vulgar, like bringing a briefcase to a beach. He appeared at her cafe most afternoons after that first conversation, always a little early, always watching the door before she arrived, though she wouldn't understand the significance of that habit until much later. He walked her home along the cliffside path some nights, close enough that their arms brushed, careful never to let her walk on the side nearest the drop. "You do that on purpose," she said one evening, after she'd noticed for the 3rd time that he'd manoeuvred her onto the inside of the path. "Do what?" "Put yourself between me and the edge." Something flickered behind his eyes, not embarrassment, but a kind of wariness, as if she'd noticed something he hadn't meant to show her. "Habit," he said simply, and changed the subject to the stars, which in Positano in July burned so bright and so close it felt like they might fall into the sea. She fell for him in pieces, the way you fall for someone when you're 22 and it's summer, and the whole world smells like lemon trees and salt water. She fell for the way he listened, not politely, not the way men listened when they were waiting for their turn to talk, but like her sentences were something worth memorizing. She fell for his hands, which were careful and deliberate in a way that seemed strange for a 24-year-old economics student. Hands that moved like they'd been trained to be gentle, because the alternative had once been necessary. She fell for the rare moments his control slipped, A flash of temper when a drunk tourist grabbed her wrist outside a bar, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by something so cold and quiet that the tourist apologized 3 times and left without being touched. "You scared him," she said afterward, breathless, not sure if she was frightened or thrilled. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't have to." He'd looked at her for a long moment then, something unreadable moving behind his expression, and said, "Some men don't need to be told twice, Beatrice. They just need to understand what they're looking at." She hadn't asked what he meant. She wished, later, after everything, that she had. By the 3rd week, she knew the shape of him better than she knew her own hometown. She knew he took his espresso standing at the bar because sitting felt, in his words, like giving up ground. She knew he flinched, almost imperceptibly, at loud noises, a dropped tray, a car backfiring, and recovered so fast most people wouldn't have caught it. She knew he called someone every night at exactly 9 o'clock, stepping away from whatever they were doing, speaking in low, rapid Italian she couldn't follow, and that he always came back, changed somehow, quieter, his jaw a little tighter. "Family business," he told her once, when she finally asked. "It follows me everywhere. I'm trying to leave it in Sicily for the summer." "Is it that bad?" He'd looked out at the water for a long time before answering. "It's not bad. It's just heavy. There's a version of my life waiting for me at home that I'm not ready for yet." He turned to her, and something in his face had gone soft in a way she hadn't seen before. "This is the only version of me that gets to just be a person. I'd like to stay him a little longer, if that's all right with you." She hadn't understood. Not fully. Not then. She thought he meant family expectations, a difficult father, the ordinary burdens of an ordinary man. She had no framework for what he actually meant, that somewhere north, in a city she'd never see, men were waiting for him to become someone capable of ordering their deaths. That the boy holding her hand on a cliffside in Positano was the last free breath of air a future don of the Moretti family would ever take. She only knew that when he looked at her, she felt like the only fixed point in a world that otherwise seemed to be spinning too fast for either of them to hold onto. She didn't know yet that she was right, that she would become, in ways neither of them could have predicted, the one thing Luca Moretti would spend the next 10 years unable to let go of, no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much blood came to sit between them. That was the summer before everything, before the letters that never arrived, before the silence that would nearly break her, before New York and penthouses and guns and a decade of grief disguised as forgetting. It began, as the worst and best things always do, with a boy at a cafe pretending to read a book he had no intention of finishing because he could not stop watching the door for a girl with yellow paint on her hands. The days took on a rhythm that Beatrice would spend the next decade trying, unsuccessfully, to forget. Mornings belonged to the workshop, the careful, monastic work of easing centuries of grime from an altarpiece with cotton swabs and solvent, her supervisor, Signora Bellini, hovering behind her like a hawk. Afternoons belonged to Luca. He would appear at the workshop door sometimes, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets, and Signora Bellini would sigh and say, va bene, go, as if Beatrice were a schoolgirl being released early, which, in the giddy euphoria of new love, was more or less how she felt. They explored the coastline like they had all the time in the world. He took her to a beach accessible only by boat, one he claimed to have found by accident, though she would later understand that nothing in Luca's life happened by accident. He'd had it scouted for privacy and sightlines without her ever knowing. They ate lunch on a blanket, bread and cheese and too much wine, and he told her stories about growing up between two countries, careful always to blur the specifics, careful never to give her a surname or a city she could later trace.
"You're very mysterious for an economics student," she teased him one afternoon, tracing a finger along his forearm where a thin white scar ran from wrist to elbow. "What's this from?" "A disagreement," he said. "With what? A shark?" "With a man who thought I was someone he could push around." He said it lightly, but his eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment, somewhere she couldn't follow. "I was younger. I didn't win every fight back then." "And now?" "Now I don't lose them." He said it without arrogance, the way another man might say, "Now I don't burn the pasta." A simple fact. She laughed it off as bravado. She had no idea how literal he was being. There were nights she would replay for years, not for what happened, though there was plenty that happened, warm and slow and unhurried, the kind of intimacy that felt less like desire and more like coming home to a place she'd never been before. She would replay them for what he said, half asleep in the dark, when his guard came down in ways it never did in daylight. "I don't know how to be a good man," he told her once, staring at the ceiling of the little rented room she shared with two other fellowship students, his arm heavy and warm across her waist. "Where I come from, good doesn't survive very long." "Where do you come from?" A long silence. "A place with rules I didn't choose and can't refuse." He turned to look at her then, and his expression had frightened her a little, not because it was cruel, but because it was so naked, grief and fear, and something that looked almost like envy, all at once. "You're the first thing in my life that didn't come with a price tag on it, Beatrice. Do you understand how rare that is? Everyone I know wants something from me. My father wants my obedience. The men under him want my mercy. The men above—" He stopped himself. "You just want me. The idiot who doesn't know how to swim properly and burns bread when he tries to cook it. Nobody's wanted that man in a very long time." "I want that man," she'd whispered, and meant it more than she'd ever meant anything. He kissed her then, like he was trying to memorize the shape of her mouth, and she felt, for the first time, a strange undercurrent of grief in it, as if some part of him already knew this couldn't last, was already grieving an ending she couldn't see coming. There were smaller warnings too, if she'd known to read them. The way he always sat with his back to the wall in restaurants, the way two men she never officially met would sometimes appear at a discreet distance when they walked through the busier parts of town, men with the build of soldiers and the watchfulness of dogs on a leash. Men Luca never acknowledged, but who never let him out of their sight either. The scar on his side, thin and precise, that he said was from a childhood accident, a fall from a fence, though the shape of it, a clean, deliberate line, looked nothing like any fence-related injury she'd ever seen. The burner phone, the second phone, that rang sometimes at odd hours and that he always answered by walking out onto the balcony and closing the door. She asked once, only once, if he was in some kind of trouble. "Not the kind you're imagining," he'd said, which was, she would understand years later,
the truth stated in a way designed to be misunderstood. I promise you, Beatrice, whatever waits for me when I go home, it will never touch you. I won't let it. She hadn't known then that a promise like that was its own kind of confession. By the 6th week, she had stopped being able to imagine the fellowship ending. She'd started, in the private architecture of her own daydreams, building a future that included him, vague and unformed, a life somewhere with lemon trees and morning light, and a man who listened to her the way no one else ever had. She didn't let herself say it out loud. She was 22. She knew, in the part of her mind that still functioned rationally, that summer romances had expiration dates stamped on them like fruit at a market stall. She just hadn't expected the expiration to come with a gunshot. It happened on a Tuesday, ordinary in every way, until it wasn't. They were walking back from the beach, sun warm and salt sticky, laughing about nothing, when one of the watchful men appeared at the end of the street, not at a discreet distance this time, but directly in their path, his face pale and urgent, in a way she'd never seen on any of Luca's associates before. He said something in rapid Sicilian dialect she couldn't pass, low and clipped, and she watched the transformation happen in front of her in real time. The boy who burned bread and laughed too easily and held her hand like it was something precious, folded himself away, and in his place stood someone else entirely, spine straight, jaw set, eyes gone flat and calculating in a way that made her stomach drop. "Luca," she said, "what's happening?" He turned to her, and for one terrible, unguarded second she saw exactly how frightened he was. Not for himself, she understood later, but for her, for what his world could reach out and touch if he let it get close enough. "I need you to go back to your apartment," he said, his voice steady in a way that didn't match his eyes. "Stay there. Don't answer the door for anyone but me." "You're scaring me." "I know." He pulled her into him, quick and hard, pressing his mouth to her hair. "I need you to trust me. Please, Beatrice, just this once." She trusted him. She went. She sat in that little rented room until midnight, until dawn, until the light turned gold again, and there was still no knock at the door, no message, nothing. And somewhere in that long, terrible night, though she wouldn't understand its full shape for another 10 years, the first thread of the rest of her life had already begun to unravel. He didn't come back for 2 days. When he finally did, he looked like a man who hadn't slept, hollow-eyed, a fading bruise along one cheekbone that he refused to explain. His hands, when they touched her face, trembling in a way she'd never seen from him before. "I have to go home," he said. "Not the trip I told you about. Not in a few weeks. Now. Tonight." "Why? What happened?" "My father." He said it like the words cost him something physical. "He's dying. Faster than anyone expected. There isn't time for me to—" He stopped, pressed his forehead to hers, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just breathed the same air, like it might be the last time they got to. "There are things I have to become, Beatrice, things I never wanted to become, and I can't, I won't, let them touch you." "I don't understand." "I know. That's the point." His thumb traced the line of her jaw like he was trying to draw her from memory before the memory had even finished happening. "Where I'm going, the people I love become targets."
Not metaphorically, actually. There are men who would hurt you badly simply because I loved you, simply to send me a message. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She didn't, not fully. Not in a way that made rational sense, but she understood the shape of his fear, the way it moved through his hands and his voice, and it terrified her more than any explanation could have. "Then don't go," she said, knowing even as she said it how childish it sounded, how impossible. "I don't have a choice." He said it so quietly she almost didn't hear it, over the sound of the waves below the cliff path where they stood. The same path he'd always kept her on the safe side of. "I was born into a life I didn't choose, and today it's calling in everything I owe it. If I don't go, people die. People who don't deserve it. I don't have the luxury of choosing myself, Beatrice. I never did. I just got to pretend for 8 weeks that I did, because of you." "Then let me come with you." His face broke just for a second, a flash of something so raw and wanting that she almost believed he'd say yes. Then it closed again, and he shook his head. "If you came with me, you'd be dead within a year, maybe less. I've seen what happens to the women who get close to men like what I'm about to become. I won't do that to you. I would rather lose you to distance than lose you to a bullet meant for me." "So what? This is it? 8 weeks and goodbye?" "No." He said it fiercely, gripping her hands so hard it almost hurt. "I'll write to you, every week. I'll tell you everything I can't say out loud right now. About my life, about what I'm walking into, about how much I—" His voice cracked, actually cracked, and she would remember that sound for 10 years. The sound of a man trying to hold together a version of himself he was about to lose forever. "I'll find a way to make this work. I don't know how yet, but I need you to wait for the letters. Can you do that? Can you trust me enough to wait?" "Yes," she said. Because she was 22 and in love and had no template yet for the particular cruelty of a promise made in good faith and broken by circumstance. "Yes, of course." He kissed her then, like a man drowning, like a man memorizing a coastline he knew he'd never see again, and when he pulled back, his eyes were wet in a way that undid something in her chest. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it even if you don't understand it yet. My name, the name I'll be known by, where I'm going, it isn't going to be the man you fell in love with. That man was real, Beatrice. He was the realest thing I've ever been allowed to be. But he's not going to survive what happens next. I need you to remember him anyway. Can you promise me that? Whatever you hear about who I become, remember this. Remember this was real." "You're frightening me." "I know," he said again, and it was the last true thing he told her that summer. "I'm sorry. I have to go." She watched him walk down the cliff path toward a black car she hadn't noticed idling at the curve of the road, 2 of his watchful men already standing at the doors. And something about the sight of it, the sudden, absolute confirmation that there was an entire machinery of a life she'd never been allowed to see, waiting to swallow him whole, made her chest cave in like a struck drum. He didn't look back. She understood, years later, that this too had been deliberate, a mercy disguised as cruelty. If he'd looked back, he wouldn't have been able to leave at all. The letters never came. She waited through August, checking the mail slot at her apartment with a hope that curdled slowly,
week by week, into something closer to grief. She waited through September, back in New York, checking an email address he'd never given her because she hadn't thought to ask for it. Some naive 22-year-old part of her, assuming a real letter, ink and paper, was more romantic, more permanent, more him. She waited through October and November, through a Christmas spent crying quietly in her childhood bedroom while her mother asked increasingly pointed questions about the Italian boy she wouldn't stop mentioning, and then, abruptly, stopped mentioning at all. By the following spring, she had stopped waiting. She told herself it was for the best, that whatever he'd walked into, whatever darkness had swallowed the boy who read books he wasn't reading and put himself between her and every cliff edge in Positano, it wasn't a darkness she was meant to survive contact with. She told herself 100 rational adult things designed to make the wound scar over cleanly. What she never told herself, not once in 10 years, not even in her most honest moments alone at 3 a.m., with a bottle of wine and old photographs she should have deleted, was that she'd stopped loving him. She hadn't. That was the cruelest part. She simply learned to carry it quietly, the way you learn to carry any grief that has nowhere left to go. Folded small, tucked away, taken out only in private, in the dark, when no one was there to see how much it still weighed. She had no way of knowing that 4,000 miles away, in a mansion outside a city he no longer left except under armed guard, Luca Moretti had written her 384 letters over the course of 10 years, every single one of them sealed, addressed, and burned before it ever reached a mailbox. Because the alternative was a death sentence he refused to sign in her name. The gallery smelled like turpentine and old money, and Beatrice Hartwell had learned over the last 3 years of running it into the ground to hate both smells equally. She stood in the back office at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, staring at a stack of overdue notices fanned across her desk like a losing poker hand, and did the math one more time, even though she already knew the answer wouldn't change, no matter how many times she ran it. Rent, $11,000 a month, 6 months behind. The restoration equipment loan she'd taken out to save her father's failing business after his stroke. $40,000 outstanding, payments missed twice. The line of credit from a private lender that her accountant had warned her in increasingly urgent emails not to take. A lender who was, as it turned out, not remotely private, not in the way she'd assumed, and who had begun sending men instead of emails. Hartwell Fine Art Restoration had been her father's life's work, a small but respected gallery and workshop in Chelsea that restored and occasionally sold minor old masters and forgotten estate pieces to collectors who valued provenance over flash. When his stroke 3 years ago had left him unable to work, Beatrice, 32, freshly certified, still privately nursing a decade-old wound she never spoke of, had stepped in to save it, because the alternative was watching her father lose the only thing he had left besides her. She was losing anyway. She just hadn't told him yet. "You're still here." Sophia Reyes, her assistant and closest friend, leaned against the office doorway with 2 coffees, though it was far too late for coffee, and they both knew it. "You should go home. Home is where the eviction notice is going to be taped to the door, so—" Beatrice rubbed her eyes. "I'm good here." Sophia set a cup down and perched on the edge of the desk, glancing at the notices with the particular grimace of someone who'd seen this exact scene play out too many times in the last month. What did Danny say? Danny, Daniel Cruz, the private lender, had stopped being a name on a spreadsheet the moment his associate had shown up at the gallery 3 weeks ago, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit who'd smiled the entire time he explained, very politely, that late payments came with late fees, and that late fees came with consequences, and that Ms. Hartwell was a smart woman who surely understood how consequences worked. "He wants the rest by Friday," Beatrice said. "All of it. 42,000, or he says he'll have to reassess our arrangement." "That's insane. You don't have $42,000. "I'm aware, Sophia." "So what happens Friday?" Beatrice didn't answer, because she genuinely didn't know, and the not knowing had kept her up more nights in the last month than she wanted to admit. She thought about her father, still living in the small apartment above the gallery because there was nowhere else for him to go, still asking her every week with a hope in his eyes that broke her heart a little more each time, whether business was picking up. She thought about the 12 years of her life she'd poured into learning a trade that felt, in this moment, like a beautiful and useless thing to know. "I could ask my cousin," Sophia offered, though they both knew her cousin didn't have that kind of money either. "You're not asking your cousin." "I could sell my car." "Sophia, I'm trying to help." "I know." Beatrice managed a smile, the first genuine one in days. "You're a terrible liar about how bad your car would sell for, but I appreciate it." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence two people share when the problem in front of them is too large to keep talking around. Outside, Chelsea moved through its nighttime rhythms. Taxis, laughter from a bar down the block, the hum of a city that didn't care whether Beatrice Hartwell kept her father's gallery or lost it, whether she slept that night or didn't. "You know," Sophia said eventually, careful in the way she got when she was about to say something Beatrice wouldn't want to hear, "there's a piece in the back, the one from the estate sale, the Flemish landscape you've been restoring. It's worth something, right? Real money?" "It's not mine to sell. It belongs to the Ashford estate. I'm just restoring it." "What if you asked them for an advance?" "I already did." Beatrice's voice went flat. "They said their next payment isn't due until the piece is finished. And it's not finished, because I've had to let go of my second restorer, because I can't pay her. Which means everything is taking twice as long, which means—" She stopped herself before the spiral could fully take hold. "It's a whole thing. I don't want to talk about it any more tonight." "Okay." Sophia squeezed her hand. "But Bea, you're not going to lose this place. I don't know how yet, but you're not." Beatrice wanted to believe her. She wanted, more than anything in that moment, to believe in the particular kind of magic where things simply worked out because you'd worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough. The kind of magic she'd believed in once, a long time ago, on a cliffside in Italy, right before it had taught her exactly how little it cared about wanting. She didn't tell Sophia that. She didn't tell anyone about Italy, not really, not the full shape of it. Not about the boy with the careful hands and the watchful men and the promise that had died somewhere over the Atlantic, along with 384 letters she never knew existed. It was a wound she'd learned to keep private, the way you keep anything private that still has the power to undo you if you look at it too directly. She had no idea locking up the gallery that night, that 4 floors up in a glass tower on Park Avenue, a man was reading her financial records on a tablet with an expression his own security detail had learned over 10 years to fear. The flat, dangerous stillness of Luca Moretti, recognizing a name he had never, not for one single day, managed to forget. Dante Falcone had worked for Luca Moretti for 9 years, long enough to know the precise geography of his boss's silences, which ones meant proceed, which ones meant danger, which ones meant nothing at all, beyond a man thinking faster than the room could keep up with. He had never, in 9 years, seen the silence currently occupying the penthouse office on the 42nd floor. "Say the name again," Luca said. He hadn't moved in almost a full minute, tablet held loosely in one hand, his other hand flat on the desk, like he needed the surface to stay upright. "Hartwell. Beatrice Hartwell." Dante consulted his notes, though he already knew them by heart. He'd pulled the file himself an hour ago, part of a routine due diligence sweep on a Chelsea lender named Daniel Cruz, who'd recently begun operating in territory the Moretti family considered, if not owned, then at least worth monitoring. Runs a small restoration gallery. Inherited it from her father. She's into Cruz for a lending arrangement that's gone bad. He's been leaning on her for weeks. Behind on rent, behind on a business loan, behind on payroll. "It's not a huge operation, boss, which is why I almost didn't flag it. But Cruz has been getting aggressive, and you told me to bring you anything involving intimidation tactics in the 5 boroughs. So, Beatrice Hartwell," Luca said again, quieter this time, and something in his voice made Dante stop talking entirely. "From Connecticut, studied art restoration, spent a summer in Italy 10 years ago." Dante blinked. "You know her?" Luca didn't answer. He set the tablet down with a care that felt, to anyone who knew him, more alarming than if he'd thrown it across the room, and turned to look out the window at the city spread beneath him. A city he owned more of than most of its residents would ever understand. Glittering and indifferent, and utterly unaware that somewhere inside it, a woman he'd loved and lost a decade ago was 3 days from losing everything her father had built. 10 years, he'd told himself, more times than he could count, that 10 years was enough distance to have made the wound scar over, the way scars were supposed to work. He'd built an empire in that time, inherited a war along with his father's title and won it. Buried men who'd tried to take what was his, married the family name to enough legitimate business that the Moretti Group now appeared on magazine covers as a real estate and private equity powerhouse, rather than what it actually was underneath the marble lobbies and Dorman buildings. He had every resource a man could want, every luxury, every form of power money and fear could buy. He had not, in 10 years, been able to think about Positano without his chest going tight, in a way no amount of success had ever managed to loosen. "Boss?" Dante's voice was careful now, testing. "You want me to handle Cruz? Standard message. Tell him to back off her account, forgive the debt, make it disappear?" "No." Luca's voice was low, controlled, and utterly final, in the way that meant the decision was already made and further discussion was a courtesy, not a negotiation. "I'll handle this myself." "Yourself?" Dante didn't bother hiding his surprise. In 9 years, Luca Moretti had never once personally handled a matter this small. He handled boardrooms, rival dons, senators who needed reminding of favours owed. He did not handle small business debt collection in Chelsea. "Boss, respectfully,
You run a multi-billion-dollar operation. Why does one gallery owner in Chelsea need the personal attention of... Because I know her. Luca turned from the window, and whatever was on his face made Dante instinctively straighten, the old soldier's reflex to a man's tone shifting into something dangerous. I knew her 10 years ago, before all of this. He gestured vaguely at the office, the city, the entire architecture of the life he'd inherited. I made her a promise I didn't keep. I'm not going to compound that by letting some third-rate loan shark put his hands on anything that belongs to her world. Belongs to her. Dante noted the phrasing and said nothing about it, though he filed it away with the careful attention of a man who had learned that Luca Moretti's silences and slips both mattered. What do you want to do?
Luca was quiet for a long moment, and Dante watched something shift behind his eyes. The flat, calculating stillness of a man building a plan in real time, layer by layer. The same expression he wore before a hostile takeover or a war council with rival capos. Except this felt different somehow. Sharper. More personal than anything Dante had seen from him in years. I want everything on Cruz. Every loan he's issued, every debt he's leaning on, every asset he's hiding offshore. I want to own his paper before he knows it's changed hands. Luca's voice had gone very quiet, very precise. The tone that terrified men far more experienced than Dante. And I want everything on Beatrice Hartwell. Not to use against her. To understand what she's walked into and how deep it goes and who else might be circling her before I get there. And once you have it, then I fix it. Luca said it like a vow, which, though neither of them would have named it that way in the moment, it was. Quietly. Without her knowing it's me. She doesn't get to know I exist in her life again until I've decided it's safe for her to know it. Dante hesitated. Boss, can I ask, why not just call her? Tell her who you are, offer to help directly. It'd be faster. Luca's jaw tightened, and for a moment Dante saw something in his boss's face he'd never seen before. Not the cold calculation of a don protecting his territory, but something rawer, older, closer to fear than anything Luca Moretti allowed himself to show. Because the last time I let her get close to me, he said, it nearly cost her life just by association, and I didn't even have half the enemies I have now. If I walk back into her world as myself, as this, every man who wants to hurt me will look at her and see the fastest way to do it. He shook his head slowly. I won't put a target on her back twice, not even to save her. I'll save her anonymously, or I'll find another way, but I will not be the reason she bleeds again. Dante had worked for Luca Moretti for 9 years. He had watched the man make decisions that ended lives with less deliberation than he was currently giving to how to save one, quietly, from 4 blocks away, without ever letting her see his face. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he had never, in 9 years, seen his boss look this much like a man in love. He simply nodded and went to make the calls that would begin quietly unmaking Daniel Cruz's entire operation before the week was out. Daniel Cruz had built his small, ugly kingdom on the principle that desperate people rarely fought back, and for 6 years it had served him well. A rotating cast of small business owners, gamblers, and families in crisis who signed his contracts because the banks had already said no, and who then spent months or years learning exactly how much interest a man like Cruz could charge when the law wasn't watching closely. He had never, in 6 years, had his entire kingdom quietly purchased out from under him in the space of 48 hours. It started with his primary backer, a mid-tier finance broker in Midtown who Cruz relied on for liquidity, who called on a Wednesday morning to inform him, with the particular brittle courtesy of a man who'd been made an offer he understood not to refuse, that their arrangement was ending immediately, and that all outstanding capital was being called in. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 other quiet financial threads Cruz depended on had similarly, inexplicably, dried up. By Thursday morning, a man in an exceptionally well-tailored suit, no name given, though Cruz would later learn from the particular quality of the silence surrounding the encounter that the man worked directly for someone whose name was better left unspoken in certain rooms, sat down across from him at his own regular breakfast diner and slid a folder across the table. Inside was a complete accounting of Cruz's operation, every loan, every debtor, every threat he'd made in the last 3 years, documented with a thoroughness that made his hands go cold. "You're going to forgive the Hartwell debt," the man said, not raising his voice, not needing to. "Today, in writing. You're also going to forget her name exists, along with the name of her gallery, along with the address of her business, effective immediately." "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who found your file interesting reading." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You have 2 options here, Mr. Cruz. Option 1, you forgive the debt, close out the account clean, and continue your business elsewhere, far elsewhere, ideally a different city, though I won't insist. Option 2. This folder, and several others like it, detailing your more colourful lending practices, finds its way to the district attorney's office by end of business today, along with several of your more litigious former clients, who I understand have been looking for exactly this kind of documentation for some time." Cruz's mouth had gone dry. "This is insane. Over one small account?" "It's not about the account." The man stood, buttoning his jacket with an unhurried precision that somehow frightened Cruz more than shouting would have. "It's about who's asking. I'd suggest you not spend too much energy wondering who that is. Just do what the folder tells you, and you'll live a long, boring, unremarkable life somewhere that isn't New York." By Thursday evening, Beatrice Hartwell received an email from Daniel Cruz's office, terse, unexplained, formatted like a form letter, informing her that her outstanding balance had been forgiven in full, effective immediately, and that the lending relationship was terminated, with no further obligation on her part. She read it 3 times, standing in the gallery's back office with Sophia peering over her shoulder, before either of them said anything. "Is this a scam?" Sophia asked. "This has to be a scam." I don't know." Beatrice's hands were shaking. $42,000 of crushing, sleepless night debt. Gone. In one paragraph of corporate boilerplate. Why would he just forgive it? People like Cruz don't forgive debt. That's the whole business model. "Call him. Ask." She did, and the number rang twice before disconnecting to a message informing her the line was no longer in service. Cruz's entire operation, as it turned out, having quietly ceased to exist some time in the previous 24 hours, its architect having relocated with impressive haste to a small apartment in Tampa, where he would, true to the well-dressed stranger's prediction, live a long and thoroughly unremarkable life. Beatrice sat down heavily in her desk chair, the email still open on her screen, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in months. The loosening of a fist she hadn't realized had been clenched around her chest for so long it had started to feel like a permanent condition. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Things like this don't just happen. Not to me. Not for free." She had no way of knowing how right she was, that nothing about it had happened for free, that the price had simply been paid by someone else, 4 floors up in a glass tower on Park Avenue, a man who had personally reviewed the folder of Daniel Cruz's crimes before sending Dante to deliver his ultimatum, and who had stood at his office window afterward for a long time, phone in hand, resisting, with a discipline that cost him more than any business negotiation he'd conducted in years, the overwhelming urge to call her, to hear her voice, to tell her everything, to undo 10 years of silence in one reckless sentence. He didn't call. He told himself it wasn't time yet, that the gallery's rent was still 6 months behind, that her equipment loan still loomed, that Cruz had been the loudest threat, but not the only one bleeding her dry, and that a man who loved her properly finished the job before he showed his face. He told himself that. He believed, mostly, that it was the whole truth. The rest of the truth, the part he wasn't ready to examine too closely, even alone, even at 2 a.m. with a glass of scotch he wasn't drinking, was that he was afraid. Not of rival families, not of federal investigators, not of any of the dozen threats that had failed to put a dent in his composure over 10 brutal years of running an empire built on violence. He was afraid of Beatrice Hartwell's face when she learned the truth about who had been standing behind her salvation. He was afraid that after everything, the silence, the broken promise, the decade of nothing, she would look at him the way you look at something you finally, mercifully, stopped grieving. He had survived a war for his family's throne. He wasn't sure he could survive that. The rent notice arrived the following Monday day, and this time, instead of the usual threatening boilerplate from the building's management company, it came with a single handwritten line clipped to the top. Account brought current. No further action required. Beatrice stared at it for a long time before calling the management office, convinced there'd been a clerical error. There hadn't been. 6 months of back rent, nearly $70,000, had been paid in full, in cash, by a courier who declined to give a name and whose payment had been processed through an LLC so deliberately opaque that even the building's own accountant, when Beatrice pressed him, could only shrug and say, "Someone wanted this handled quietly. That's all I know." "This is insane," she told Sophia that evening, the two of them sitting on the gallery floor, surrounded by paperwork, a bottle of wine between them that neither had touched. 2 separate debts wiped out in a week by 2 separate anonymous parties. That doesn't happen by accident. "Do you have an enemy who secretly loves you?" Sophia offered, only half joking. "I don't have any enemies. I barely have friends outside of you." "Ex-boyfriend, then. Someone from your past who got rich and guilty." Beatrice's chest did something complicated at that. A flicker, fast and involuntary, of a cliffside in Italy, a voice saying, "I'll find a way to make this work." And she pushed it down, hard, the way she'd trained herself to for 10 years. "There's no one like that. Trust me." "There's always someone like that." Sophia refilled both their glasses, despite the fact that neither had drunk from the first pour. "Come on, B. You've had exactly one great love story in your entire life, and you've never told me the whole thing." Every time I bring up Italy, you get this look. I'm not talking about Italy. See? That look. Sophia softened, setting her glass down, suddenly serious in the way she got when she genuinely worried about her friend rather than teased her.
Whoever it is, whoever's doing this, it doesn't feel dangerous to me. It feels like someone's protecting you. That's not nothing. Beatrice didn't answer because she didn't trust her voice not to shake if she did. She'd built her entire adult life on the careful architecture of not thinking about Italy, not thinking about Luca, not wondering what had happened to a boy who'd promised to write and then vanished so completely it was as if he'd never existed at all. She'd Googled him exactly once, 3 years after Positano, in a moment of drunken weakness. Luca, Sicily, economics student, and found nothing, because of course she found nothing. She didn't have a surname, didn't have a hometown, had nothing but a first name and a memory so vivid it sometimes still ambushed her in the middle of ordinary days. The smell of espresso, or the particular gold of late afternoon light, enough to send her back to a cliffside path with her hand in his. She told herself that night and every night after that it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Whoever Luca had become, wherever he'd disappeared to, he had no reason to know she existed, let alone that she was drowning, let alone the resources to quietly, comprehensively save her. She was wrong on every count, and some instinctive, buried part of her, the part that still, 10 years later, recognized the particular shape of being protected by someone who refused to let her see his hand, knew it. The pattern continued through November. Her equipment loan, $40,000, resolved in a single wire transfer that her lender's compliance department flagged, investigated, and ultimately closed without comment, the payment untraceable to any account they could subpoena. A commission for the Flemish landscape restoration came through at triple her usual rate, from a private collector whose representative, polished, evasive, expensively dressed, declined every question about who exactly he represented. New clients began appearing with suspicious regularity, wealthy, discreet, uninterested in negotiating her fees, as if someone were quietly feeding business her way faster than she could keep up with it. By the first week of December, Hartwell Fine Art Restoration was, for the first time in 3 years, not just solvent, but thriving, and Beatrice Hartwell, 32 years old, exhausted from a decade of grief she'd never fully processed, found herself lying awake most nights, turning over the same impossible question. Who and why and how long before they wanted something in return? She got her answer sooner than she expected, though not the answer she was looking for. It arrived on a Thursday evening in the form of an invitation. Heavy cream cardstock, gold foil lettering, delivered by hand to the gallery with no return address. Requesting the presence of Ms. Beatrice Hartwell at the Winter Gala of the Moretti Foundation for the Arts, to be held at the Moretti family's Fifth Avenue residence in recognition of her contribution to the preservation of fine art in New York City. Beatrice read the name twice, 3 times, her pulse doing something strange and arrhythmic in her chest. Moretti. It was, she told herself firmly, a common enough Italian surname. There was no reason it should make her hands shake as badly as they were shaking now. No reason the letters of it should feel like a hand closing slowly around her throat. No reason at all except the deep animal certainty, older than logic, older than the decade of careful forgetting she'd built her life on top of,
That some circle she'd thought closed forever was, impossibly, about to open again. "Sophia," she said, her voice unsteady, "I think I need to sit down." Luca Moretti stood in the private elevator of his Fifth Avenue residence 3 days before the gala, staring at a photograph on his phone that Dante had pulled from the gallery's public website. A professional headshot, Beatrice in a dark blazer, hair shorter than he remembered, a careful, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes the way her real smile used to. He had looked at this photograph more times in the last 2 weeks than he was willing to admit to anyone, including himself. 10 years had changed her, the way 10 years changed anyone. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes now, a settled weight to her expression that spoke of a decade's worth of disappointments he hadn't been there to soften. She looked tired, in a way the 22-year-old girl with paint on her hands had never looked tired. She looked, he thought, like a woman who'd spent a long time holding herself together with sheer stubbornness, because no one had offered to help her carry the weight. He hated it. He hated it with an intensity that surprised even him, a man who had, by most objective measures, stopped being surprised by his own capacity for violence somewhere around his 28th birthday. He wanted to find every person who had made her life this hard in the last 10 years and make them understand in explicit and permanent terms exactly what a mistake that had been. "You're doing the thing again," Dante said from the doorway, where he'd been standing for a full minute before Luca acknowledged him. "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're about to have someone killed over a photograph." Dante crossed the room and took the seat across from Luca's desk, uninvited, which he only did when he judged the moment serious enough to warrant it. "Boss, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer instead of doing the stare." Luca set the phone down, deliberately, and gave Dante his full attention, which, after 9 years of working for the man, Dante understood to be its own kind of answer, a rare concession that the conversation mattered enough to earn it. "Ask." "The gala invitation. That was your idea, not mine. I just executed it. Why do this now? You've spent 3 weeks making sure she never sees your hand in any of it. Now you're inviting her to your own house, under your own family's name, where she's going to be standing in a room full of people who all know exactly who you are." Dante leaned forward. "You understand that the second she walks in and hears anyone say Mr. Moretti, this whole careful thing you've built falls apart in about 4 seconds. Luca was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual command. It sounded, for the first time in longer than Dante could remember, uncertain. "I know." "Then why?" "Because I'm tired of being a ghost in her life." Luca stood, walking to the window that looked out over the darkened expanse of Central Park, hands clasped behind his back, in the posture Dante recognized as the one he used when he was fighting to keep something contained. "I've spent 3 weeks fixing every broken thing in her world without letting her see my face, and it should feel like enough. It should feel like I've done right by her, finally, after 10 years of doing nothing at all. It doesn't." He turned, and the expression on his face made Dante's chest tighten with something like sympathy, an emotion he rarely associated with his employer. "I want to see her, Dante.
I want to stand in the same room as her and know that this time I'm not walking away. I've spent 10 years telling myself distance was love. I don't believe that anymore. I don't think I ever really did. And if she hates you, if she finds out you're the one who's been pulling strings behind her back for weeks, on top of disappearing on her 10 years ago without a word, you understand that could go very badly. I know that too. Luca's voice was steady now, resolved, the sound of a man who had made peace with a risk because the alternative had become unbearable. But I would rather stand in front of her and let her hate me to my face than spend one more year loving her from a distance she doesn't even know exists. I've made a lot of decisions in my life out of fear, Dante. Decisions that protected everyone, except the part of me that actually wanted something. I'm done making those decisions. If this is the only chance I get to explain myself, I'm taking it. Dante studied him for a long moment. This man who commanded armies of soldiers and boardrooms full of legitimate power brokers with equal, effortless authority, reduced by the mention of one woman's name to something that looked, disconcertingly, like fear. "For what it's worth," Dante said finally, standing, "I've worked for you 9 years. I've seen you take over a criminal empire at 24 and hold it against 3 separate attempts to take it from you. I've never seen you scared before tonight." "I'm not scared of losing the empire," Luca said quietly, turning back to the window, to the city that had never once managed to make him feel as unmoored as the thought of Beatrice Hartwell's face when she recognized him finally did. "I'm scared of losing the only thing in 10 years that ever made me feel like a person instead of a title." 3 nights later, the gala began. Somewhere in a townhouse in Chelsea, Beatrice Hartwell stood in front of her mirror in a dress she couldn't quite afford, smoothing down fabric with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, telling herself over and over that it was just a coincidence of surnames, that there was no possible way the man hosting tonight's gala could be the boy she'd loved and lost a decade ago on a cliffside in Italy. She was about to learn, in the most public and devastating way possible, exactly how wrong she was. The Moretti residence occupied an entire townhouse on Fifth Avenue, overlooking Central Park, 5 stories of restrained, old-money grandeur that gave away nothing of the empire's true nature to the uninitiated eye. Marble floors, a curated collection of Italian masters on the walls, several of which Beatrice would later realize with a jolt she recognized from restoration circles as pieces with famously murky provenance. And enough security discreetly positioned throughout the crowd that a careful observer might have counted a dozen men whose tailored suits did nothing to disguise the alertness in their eyes. Beatrice was not, that night, a careful observer. She was too busy trying to keep her champagne glass from shaking to notice much of anything beyond the sheer, overwhelming scale of the wealth surrounding her. Women in gowns that cost more than her gallery's monthly rent used to be. Men whose watches alone could have covered her old equipment loan twice over. A string quartet playing something achingly beautiful in the corner of a ballroom that seemed to stretch on forever. "This is insane," Sophia whispered beside her, resplendent in a borrowed dress and doing a marginally better job of hiding her nerves. "B, do you know who these people are? That's a senator by the bar. I think that's a senator." "I don't know anyone here." Beatrice's eyes swept the room for what felt like the 100th time, searching for something she couldn't name, some confirmation of the dread
that had been sitting in her stomach since the invitation arrived. "I don't even know why I was invited." "I restore paintings, Sophia. I don't run in circles that own paintings like this." "Maybe your mystery benefactor wanted you here." Beatrice's stomach twisted. She hadn't told Sophia the full shape of her suspicion, hadn't told anyone, because saying it out loud felt like giving it a power she wasn't ready to grant. But some instinctive, animal part of her had known, from the moment she'd read the name Moretti on that invitation, that tonight was going to answer a question she'd spent 10 years too afraid to ask. "Ladies and gentlemen." The room's ambient noise dimmed as a voice, smooth, commanding, carrying easily to every corner of the ballroom without seeming to strain for volume, cut through the chatter. "Thank you for joining us tonight in support of the Moretti Foundation for the Arts." Beatrice turned toward the small raised platform at the front of the ballroom, and the champagne glass slipped an inch in her suddenly nerveless fingers. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself now. Not the loose, easy posture of a 24-year-old pretending to be an economics student, but the coiled, contained stillness of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how much presence he could command with the smallest gesture. His hair was the same dark, though threaded now with the faintest silver at the temples. His jaw was the same, that ruler-straight line she'd once traced with her fingertip on a cliffside path. His eyes, dark, direct, missing nothing, swept the room with the practiced ease of a man scanning for threats before they ever settled, for one endless, devastating second, on her. The room around Beatrice seemed to tilt. It's him. 10 years. 10 years of silence, of grief she'd never fully named, of a wound she'd told herself had scarred over, and here he was, standing at the front of a ballroom in his own family's mansion, wearing the kind of quiet, absolute authority that made senators and captains of industry go still when he spoke, and looking at her like she was the only person in a room of 300 people. "B?" Sophia's voice seemed to come from very far away. "B, are you okay? You've gone completely white." She couldn't answer. She couldn't do anything except stand there, frozen, watching Luca Moretti, her mind supplied, hysterically, the surname landing like a physical blow, finish his brief remarks about the Foundation's mission with a composure that felt, now that she was watching for it, like the most sophisticated performance she'd ever seen. A mask worn so long it had become indistinguishable from skin. He stepped down from the platform. The crowd absorbed him instantly, a dozen conversations reaching for his attention, and for one disorienting moment, Beatrice thought, hoped, feared, she couldn't tell which, that he might simply be swallowed by the room, that she might have the chance to leave before whatever was about to happen actually happened. He didn't let that happen. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried inevitability of a man who had never once in his adult life failed to get exactly where he intended to go, offering brief, gracious words to well-wishers without ever losing the trajectory of his path. A path, Beatrice realized with her heart hammering somewhere up in her throat, that led directly to her. "Miss Hartwell." His voice, when he finally stood in front of her, was pitched low, meant for her alone, and it did something to her chest that 10 years of careful forgetting had utterly failed to prepare her for. "Thank you for coming tonight." Up close, the changes in him were even more staggering. The boyish softness she remembered entirely burned away, replaced by something harder, more controlled, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with the sheer, contained power of him. But his eyes were exactly the same, dark and direct, and, for one unguarded second as they met hers, utterly, achingly familiar. "Luca." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to, barely above a whisper, but she saw it land on him like a physical blow, saw something crack, briefly, in the careful composure he'd built for the room around them. "It's really you." "It's really me," he said quietly, and for one suspended, silent moment, 10 years seemed to collapse into nothing at all. "I've been waiting a long time to say that to you." Sophia, sensing something enormous unfolding that she didn't yet understand, took a careful step back, murmuring something about finding the bar. Beatrice barely registered her leaving. The entire ballroom, the string quartet, the senators and socialites and glittering wealth, all of it receded into a kind of white noise, leaving only the two of them, standing 3 feet apart, 10 years and an ocean of unanswered questions suddenly compressed into the space between one breath and the next. "You're the one," Beatrice said, slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one more devastating than the last. "The debt, the rent, the commissions. It was you, all of it." "Yes." 10 years, Luca." Her voice shook, anger finally cutting through the shock. 10 years of carefully buried grief surging up all at once. 10 years of nothing, no letter, no call, not a single word to tell me you were alive, and now you just swoop in and fix my life like some kind of guilty conscience, and you think that makes it... "It doesn't make anything right," he said quietly, cutting through her building fury, not with force, but with something far more devastating. Raw, naked honesty, delivered in a voice that trembled, just slightly, for the first time since she'd known him. "Nothing makes it right, Beatrice. I know that. I've known it every single day for 10 years. But I need you to give me the chance to explain. Because the reason I disappeared is not the reason you think, and I promise you, if you let me tell you the truth, you'll understand why staying away from you was the hardest thing I've ever done." Around them the gala continued, oblivious. Champagne poured, laughter rose and fell. The string quartet moved into something slower, more romantic, entirely unaware that at its centre, two people who had spent a decade grieving each other in silence were finally, terrifyingly, standing close enough to touch. He took her to a private study on the second floor, away from the noise of the gala, away from the watchful eyes of guests who would have read far too much into the sight of Luca Moretti, leading a woman none of them recognized, away from his own party, with his hand hovering, protective and possessive, at the small of her back, without ever quite touching her. The room was quieter than the ballroom below, but no less staggering. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books, a fireplace already lit, a wall of windows overlooking the park. Beatrice barely noticed any of it. She stood in the centre of the room with her arms crossed over her chest, holding herself together through sheer will, and watched Luca close the door behind them with the careful, deliberate movements of a man buying himself time to find the right words. "Start talking," she said. "You owe me 10 years of explanation, and I want all of it." "You're right." He turned to face her, and the mask he'd worn downstairs, smooth, controlled, every inch the powerful host, had entirely fallen away, leaving something rawer and more uncertain in its place, something that looked almost like the boy from Positano. I'll give you all of it, but you should sit down. Some of it isn't easy to hear. I've spent 10 years not knowing. I can handle sitting. He almost smiled at that. A flash of the dry humour she remembered, gone as quickly as it appeared, and gestured her toward one of the leather chairs by the fire. He didn't sit across from her, he knelt instead in front of her chair, close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago, the small scar at his temple that definitely hadn't. My father died 11 days after I left Positano, he began. The story I told you, about my family, about a heavy inheritance waiting for me at home, I wasn't lying exactly, but I wasn't telling you the truth either. My family isn't in real estate, not primarily. Not the way the foundation downstairs would like the world to believe. His jaw tightened. My father was the head of what the newspapers, when they're feeling polite, call an organized crime family. I was his only son. When he died, I became the head of it instead. 24 years old, thrown into a war for control that I hadn't asked for and wasn't remotely ready to fight. Beatrice sat very still, absorbing this, watching pieces of a 10-year-old puzzle click into place with a clarity that made her chest ache. The watchful men, the burner phone, the scar he'd claimed came from a fence, the way he'd always known where every exit in a room was before he ever sat down. "You knew," she said slowly. "In Italy, you already knew this was waiting for you." I knew what I was born into. I didn't know how fast it would come for me, or how brutal it would be when it did. His voice had gone low, distant, the voice of a man reliving something he'd spent a decade trying not to. There was a war for control the moment my father died. 3 different capos who thought a 24-year-old economics graduate with soft hands didn't have the stomach to hold what he'd inherited. They were half right. I didn't have the stomach for it. I did it anyway, because the alternative was watching everything my father built get carved apart by men who would have been far crueler rulers than I ever was. It took 2 years to secure my position completely. 2 years of war, Beatrice. Men died. I made sure some of them died. I became, in that time, someone I genuinely did not recognize when I looked in a mirror. "And the letters?" Her voice cracked on the word, the wound she'd carried for a decade finally fully exposed. "You said you'd write. Every week. You promised." "I did write." He reached into his jacket and produced, with hands that were visibly unsteady, a small leather-bound notebook, worn soft at the edges from a decade of handling. "I wrote you a letter almost every week for the first 3 years, Beatrice. Sometimes more than one. 384 of them by the end. Though I stopped counting somewhere around year 6, because counting them felt like counting failures." He opened the notebook. It wasn't letters, she realized. It was a ledger. Entries in careful, cramped handwriting, dates spanning a decade, each one a brief notation. Letter written. Burned. February 3rd. Over and over, hundreds of times, a decade's worth of confessions that had never once reached her. "I burned every single one," he said quietly, "because the war for control of my family made enemies, Beatrice. Real ones. Men who would have paid any price to hurt me. And the fastest way to hurt a man like me is to find the one thing he loves that isn't already armed and protected. If I'd sent even a single letter, if anyone had traced a single piece of correspondence back to a woman in New York who I clearly cared about, you would have become a target within the week. Not a metaphorical one, an actual one, kidnapping, or worse, used as leverage to control me, or simply murdered to send a message about what happens to the people I love. I watched it happen to other men in my position, Beatrice. I watched men I respected lose wives, sisters, children, because they didn't understand or didn't care how visible love makes you in a world like mine. So you decided for me. Her voice was quiet now, more devastated than angry. You decided I didn't get a choice in how much danger I was willing to accept for you. Yes. He held her gaze, unflinching, though it clearly cost him something to do it. I made that choice, and I know it wasn't mine to make. I've had 10 years to regret it, and I do, every single day. But I want you to understand, it wasn't indifference, Beatrice. It wasn't that I stopped loving you, or moved on, or forgot. I wrote you a letter every week for 3 years and burned every single one, because I loved you too much to risk what sending them would cost you. Silence was the only gift I had left to give you. I hated every year of it. The room was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Beatrice looked down at the ledger in his hands. 384 entries, a decade of grief documented in a stranger's careful handwriting that was, impossibly, the same handwriting she'd once watched sketch her portrait on a cafe napkin in Positano, and felt something in her chest that she couldn't yet name. Not quite forgiveness, not quite anger, but something raw and enormous, moving between the two. "Show me," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Show me what you would have said if you'd been brave enough to send them." Luca's hand, when he offered her the ledger, was shaking. She read by firelight, Luca kneeling silent beside her chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that every page she turned felt like an act of enormous, terrifying intimacy. The entries weren't full letters. He'd burned the letters themselves, every one, but he'd kept fragments, first lines, the openings he could never bring himself to destroy entirely, as if some part of him had known that one day he'd need proof of everything he'd felt and never said. March 12th. My father is dead 6 days, and I already don't recognize the man in the mirror. I keep thinking about the way you laughed at the fish market when the vendor tried to overcharge us. I would give anything to hear that laugh right now. July 9th. I killed a man today. I'm not going to tell you the details because I don't want them anywhere near you. Not even on paper I'll burn within the hour. I keep thinking, what would Beatrice think of me now? I already know the answer. That's why I can't send this. November 30th. It's been a year. I think about you every single day, which I know is a pathetic thing for a man in my position to admit, even to a piece of paper he's about to set on fire. I hope you've found someone who deserves you. I hope, selfishly, that you haven't. February 3rd, Year 3. I got engaged today. Arranged for the business, nothing that will ever mean what you meant. I signed the papers and thought about the way you used to trace the scar on my arm and ask about it like it was the most interesting thing in the world, instead of proof of every mistake I've ever made. I called off the engagement 4 months later.
I told my advisors it was business reasons. It wasn't. Beatrice's hands were shaking too hard to turn the next page. You were engaged. For 4 months. To a woman I respected and never once loved, because my advisors believed the alliance would strengthen the family's position, and because some part of me had decided that if I couldn't have you, it didn't matter who I ended up with instead. Luca's voice was low, careful. I called it off. It cost me politically, cost me an alliance I needed. I did it anyway, because signing those papers made me understand something I'd been avoiding for 3 years. I wasn't ever going to stop loving you, no matter how much time passed, no matter how hard I tried to build a life that didn't include you. I decided I'd rather be alone and honest about that than married to a lie. She kept reading, page after page, a decade of a man's private grief laid bare in fragments he'd never intended anyone to see. Entries that documented not just his feelings, but the slow, brutal construction of the empire he now ruled. Wars won, rivals eliminated, alliances forged and broken, a young man's soft edges ground down year by year into the controlled, dangerous stillness she'd watched command an entire ballroom downstairs. And threaded through every single entry, without fail, without exception across 10 years and hundreds of pages, was her name. Beatrice would have hated this. Beatrice would have laughed at this. I wonder what Beatrice is doing tonight. I wonder if Beatrice ever thinks about me. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago. I found her. 10 years, and it took my head of security 40 minutes to find her once I finally let myself look. She's in trouble. The kind of trouble that makes my hands want to burn the whole city down. I'm going to fix it. I'm not going to let her know it's me, not yet, not until I've earned the right to stand in front of her again. I don't know if that right exists. I don't know if 10 years of silence is a debt that can ever actually be repaid. But I have to try. I would rather spend the rest of my life trying and failing than spend one more day pretending I've moved on from the only thing that ever made me want to be a better man than the one this life demanded I become. Beatrice closed the ledger slowly, her vision blurred with tears she hadn't let herself shed yet, and looked down at Luca. This man who had once been a boy on a cliffside, promising her a future he'd known, even then, he might not be able to give her. "You should have told me," she said, her voice raw. "Even if you couldn't send the letters, even if it was dangerous, you should have found some way, at some point in 10 years, to let me know you were alive, that you hadn't just discarded me. That the last 10 years of my life weren't built on a lie I told myself to survive the grief." I know. He didn't defend himself, didn't reach for excuses. He simply knelt there and absorbed the accusation like a man accepting a verdict he'd already passed on himself 1,000 times. "I've told myself the same thing every year for 10 years, Beatrice. I chose your physical safety over your emotional peace, and I understand now that it wasn't entirely my choice to make. I took something from you that I had no right to take. The simple decency of knowing whether the man you loved was alive, whether he still thought of you, whether any of it had been real. I'm not going to pretend that was the right decision. I'm only going to tell you that it was the decision of a man who loved you enough to be a coward about everything except keeping you alive." The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the room for a long moment. Beatrice looked at him, really looked, past the expensive suit and the controlled authority and the decade of hardness that had settled into his features, and saw underneath all of it the same boy who'd put himself between her and every cliff edge in Positano, still there, still terrified of losing her, just buried now under 10 years of blood and power he'd never wanted in the first place. "I don't know how to forgive 10 years," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can just hand that back to you, because you kept a ledger of letters you never sent." "I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight." Luca reached up, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek with a gentleness that undid something in her chest that 10 years of careful distance had failed to protect. "I'm asking you to let me try to earn it, however long that takes. I've waited 10 years to be in the same room as you again, Beatrice. I can wait a great deal longer to be forgiven, as long as you let me stay close enough to try." She didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer, not with a decade of grief and love and fury all tangled together in her chest, too large and too complicated to resolve in a single firelit room at the end of a gala neither of them had wanted to end this way. She let him hold her hand anyway, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, just sat together in the quiet. 10 years of silence, finally, imperfectly, beginning to break. Salvatore Rienzi watched the exchange between Luca Moretti and the unknown woman from across the ballroom with the patient, calculating attention of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read exactly what other men tried hardest to hide. He had come to the Moretti Gala for the usual reasons, to be seen, to remind New York's other families that the Rienzi organization still commanded respect despite 2 years of quiet, humiliating territorial losses to Moretti's expanding operation. To gather whatever small intelligence a room full of loose-lipped socialites and half-drunk businessmen might yield. He had not expected to find something as valuable as what he'd just witnessed. Luca Moretti, cold, controlled, famously immune to anything resembling sentiment in 10 years of ruthless expansion, abandoning his own party to disappear upstairs with a woman none of Rienzi's people recognized, wearing an expression Rienzi hadn't seen on the man's face in a decade of careful observation. "Find out who she is," he told his associate quietly. Not looking away from the staircase Luca and the woman had disappeared up 20 minutes ago and hadn't yet descended. "Tonight. I want a name before I leave this building." It took his associate less than an hour. By the time Rienzi's car pulled away from Fifth Avenue, he had a name: Beatrice Hartwell, gallery owner, Chelsea. A set of financial records showing a debt crisis resolved with suspicious speed and even more suspicious anonymity, and a working theory that made him smile for the first time in weeks. Salvatore Rienzi had spent 2 years losing ground to Luca Moretti in a war fought entirely through boardrooms, shell companies, and quiet political pressure rather than the bloodier methods his own father had favoured, a war he was losing, decisively, because Luca Moretti had never given him a single weakness to exploit. The man had no wife, no children, no visible attachments beyond the empire itself. He was, by every account Rienzi's people had gathered over 2 years of careful surveillance, essentially unassailable through anything other than direct force, and direct force against an organization as heavily fortified as Moretti's was a war Rienzi knew he couldn't win. He had just found his first weakness in 10 years.
Beatrice Hartwell, he said to himself in the quiet of his car, turning the name over like a coin he was deciding how to spend. Let's find out exactly how much you're worth to him. 2 days after the gala, Beatrice returned to the gallery to find a bouquet of white roses waiting on her desk. No card, no note, but the particular quality of the arrangement, the rarity of the blooms in December, spoke of money that didn't need to announce itself. She knew, before Sophia even said anything, exactly who they were from. "He's not subtle, is he?" Sophia said, arranging the flowers with poorly disguised delight, having extracted most of the story from Beatrice over the 2 days since the gala, in a conversation that had lasted until 3 a.m. and left them both emotionally wrung out. 10 years of silence, and now he's sending roses like a teenager. It's not funny, Sophia. I didn't say it was funny. I said it was sweet, in a completely insane Mafia-adjacent way. Sophia's expression sobered. How are you actually doing? With all of it? Beatrice sat down heavily at her desk, staring at the roses without really seeing them. I don't know. I keep going back and forth between wanting to scream at him for 10 years of silence and wanting to... She stopped herself, embarrassed by how much of the sentence she'd been about to admit out loud. Wanting to what? Wanting to let him back in, she admitted quietly. Which is insane, right? He's not just some guy who ghosted me after a summer fling. He runs an actual crime family, Sophia. Guns and I don't even know what else. Things I probably don't want to know about. And I'm sitting here holding a bouquet of roses like a lovesick teenager instead of running the other direction as fast as I can. For what it's worth, Sophia said carefully, I've known you 3 years, and I've never seen you talk about anyone the way you talked about him at 2 a.m. 2 nights ago. Not once. You've dated, what, 4 guys in 3 years? And you talked about all of them like you were reading a grocery list. This is different. I'm not telling you what to do with that information. I'm just telling you it's information. Beatrice didn't respond because she didn't have an answer that felt honest enough to say out loud. She was still sitting there, staring at the roses, turning over 10 years of grief and one devastating night of revelation, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know this is complicated. I don't expect anything from you. I only want the chance to know you again, on whatever terms you're willing to give me. Dinner, if you'll allow it. No pressure, no expectations beyond your company. L. She stared at the message for a long time before she realized she was smiling, small, reluctant, but real. The first genuine smile she'd allowed herself about any of this since the gala. She had no idea, typing back her careful, uncertain yes, that 4 miles away, Salvatore Rienzi was already assembling a file on Beatrice Hartwell thick enough to plan an entire campaign around. A campaign designed not to attack Luca Moretti directly, where he was strongest, but to reach him through the one door he'd just, catastrophically, opened. He took her to a restaurant so private it didn't have a name on the door. A converted townhouse in the West Village with exactly 1 table, reserved permanently for the Moretti family's use. Staffed by a chef who'd trained in Palermo and a single, impeccably discreet waiter who disappeared entirely for the length of their meal. This is a lot, Beatrice said, taking in the dim, candlelit room, the exposed brick, the single, perfect table set for 2. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to.
Luca pulled out her chair, a small, old-fashioned courtesy that felt, somehow, more intimate than anything else about the elaborate setup. I've had 10 years to imagine what I'd say to you if I ever got the chance again. I wanted the setting to at least try to match how long I've been waiting. They talked for hours, carefully at first, both of them navigating the strange territory of two people who'd once known each other completely and now had a decade of separate lives to account for. She told him about her father's stroke, about the gallery, about the slow, grinding fear of the last 3 years that she'd never fully admitted to anyone, not even Sophia. He told her, carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man aware of exactly how much weight they carried, about the war for his family's territory, about the men he'd lost and the men he'd been forced to become, about 10 years of building an empire he'd never wanted, in the hope, however irrational, that if he built it well enough, he might one day be able to offer it to someone who made it feel worth having. "Do you regret it?" she asked at one point, watching him over the rim of her wine-glass. "The life you inherited. Do you ever wish you'd been allowed to just be, whoever you would have been, if none of this had ever come for you?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with more seriousness than she'd expected. "For years, yes. I used to lie awake calculating exactly what my life would look like if my father had lived another decade, if I'd been allowed to stay in Italy, if I'd gotten to be the economics student I pretended to be that summer, instead of the man I actually became." He looked at her, something raw and honest moving behind his eyes. "I don't think that way anymore. Not because I've made peace with everything this life has cost me. I haven't, not entirely, and I'm not sure I ever will. But because that version of me, the one who stayed an ordinary student, never would have found you again. Never would have had the resources or the reach to fix what was breaking in your life before it broke you completely. Some nights, that's the only thing that makes any of it feel worth the cost." "That's a heavy thing to put on me," she said quietly. "Being the reason you don't regret becoming this." "I know." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, giving her the choice. "I'm not trying to put weight on you. I'm trying to be honest, because I spent 10 years being anything but, and I'd rather you know exactly what you're looking at than fall for another version of me that isn't real." She let him take her hand. They were 3 courses into the meal, deep in a conversation about her father's slow recovery, when Luca's phone buzzed against the table. Once, then again in rapid succession, a pattern she'd already learned in the short time she'd known this version of him meant something urgent enough to interrupt even this. He glanced at the screen, and she watched his entire posture change in an instant. The warm, unguarded man across the table replaced by something colder, sharper, dangerous in a way that made her breath catch. "What is it?" "Nothing you need to worry about." His voice had gone flat, controlled, and she recognized with a chill the same transformation she'd witnessed once before, a decade ago, on a street in Positano, right before he'd disappeared for 2 days and come back changed. "I need to step outside for a moment. Dante's going to sit with you until I'm back. You'll be completely safe, I promise you that." He was gone less than 10 minutes, but when he returned, something in his face had shifted permanently. A new wariness layered over the warmth from before, his eyes moving to the restaurant's windows and door with the alert, cataloguing attention of a man reassessing every threat in the room. "Luca, tell me what happened." He hesitated, and she watched him weigh, visibly, how much to tell her. The old instinct to protect her through silence, warring this time with something new, a decision he seemed to be making in real time. "There's a man named Salvatore Rienzi," he said finally. "He runs a rival organization. We've been in a quiet conflict for 2 years. Territory, business, nothing that's ever spilled into open violence, which is rare and, until tonight, something I was fairly confident about maintaining." His jaw tightened. "My security intercepted communication tonight, suggesting he's had someone watching this restaurant, watching us, which means he knows who you are, Beatrice, and knows that you matter to me, which makes you the first genuine leverage he's found against me in 2 years of trying." Her stomach dropped, the warm intimacy of the evening curdling instantly into something closer to fear. "Leverage? You mean he'd— what? Hurt me? To get to you?" "I mean, I'm not going to let that happen." His voice was absolutely certain, cold in a way that would have frightened her if it hadn't been directed entirely toward her protection. "But I need you to understand what tonight means. The moment I brought you into my world publicly, the gala, tonight, all of it, I made you visible to every enemy I have. I told myself I was ready for that risk. I'm going to prove it to you, starting now. You're not going home alone tonight. You're not going anywhere alone until I've dealt with this." "Luca, I have a business to run, a father to take care of. I can't just—" "You can, and you will, because the alternative is a risk I refuse to take with your life." His hand found hers across the table, grip firm, urgent. "I know how this sounds. I know it's exactly the kind of control I promised myself I'd never exercise over you again. That I have spent 10 years living with the consequences of choosing your safety over your freedom, Beatrice. And I would rather have that fight with you 100 times than lose you to a man like Rienzi because I was too afraid of your anger to protect you properly this time." Outside the restaurant, unseen by either of them, a car idled at the end of the block. One of Rienzi's men, patient and unhurried, already composing the report that would set in motion the most dangerous chapter of either of their lives. The following weeks unfolded with a strange whiplash rhythm. Days of careful, tender intimacy giving way without warning to nights punctuated by security briefings and the low hum of danger that had, whether Beatrice liked it or not, become the backdrop of her entire life. Luca had moved 2 of his men, quiet, watchful presences named Marco and Enzo, into the apartment above her gallery, ostensibly as additional staff, though everyone in the building understood within a week that they were something else entirely. Her father, Walter, initially confused by the sudden appearance of 2 broad-shouldered men who seemed to materialize whenever Beatrice left the building, had taken the explanation with a calm that surprised her. "He's protecting you," Walter said one evening, watching from his window as Marco walked Beatrice the half-block from the gallery to the townhouse. "The Italian boy, from 10 years ago." Beatrice froze. "How do you know about him?" "You talked in your sleep for 2 years after you came back from Italy." Her father's smile was gentle, sad. "I never told you because I didn't know what to say. You'd wake up some mornings and I'd find you crying in the kitchen and pretending you weren't. And I didn't have the first idea how to help you carry whatever it was. I'm glad, for whatever it's worth, that he came back. I'm less glad about the armed men in my apartment. But I understand why they're here. It's complicated, Dad. Love usually is.
He squeezed her hand, the same gesture he'd used her whole childhood to signal that a conversation was ending on his terms. Gentle, but final. Just be careful, Beatrice. Whatever he is, whatever world he's dragging you back into, be careful. She tried. She genuinely tried in those weeks to maintain some careful boundary between her old life and the increasingly consuming reality of Luca's world, to run her gallery, to manage her father's care, to be the independent woman she'd spent 3 grueling years building herself into, even as Luca's presence expanded through every corner of her existence with the patient, inexorable pressure of water finding every crack in a dam. He was, she learned quickly, almost unbearably possessive, not in ways that felt controlling exactly, but in 100 small gestures that spoke of a man reclaiming territory he considered, on some deep and unshakable level, his own. He showed up unannounced at the gallery with lunch on days he knew she'd forget to eat. He had Marco and Enzo trail her, not just to protect her from Rienzi, but, she suspected, because the idea of her moving through the city, unwatched by someone loyal to him, was, after 10 years of not knowing where she was or whether she was safe, close to unbearable for him. He asked, more than once, with a carefully controlled edge to his voice, about the men she dated in the last decade, not accusingly, but with a raw, unmistakable jealousy that he made no real effort to disguise. "You don't have the right to be jealous of my past relationships," she told him once, only half teasing, after he'd gone unusually quiet at dinner following an offhand mention of an ex-boyfriend. "You disappeared for 10 years, Luca. I was allowed to date people." "I know that." His jaw was tight, his eyes dark. "It doesn't make it easier to hear about some man putting his hands on you while I was 4,000 miles away burning letters instead of sending them." He looked up, and the rawness in his expression caught her off guard. "I'm not proud of how possessive this makes me feel, Beatrice. I've spent 10 years imagining you moving through a life I wasn't part of. And now that I'm finally allowed to be part of it, some ugly, primitive part of me wants to erase every single day you spent without me. I know that's not fair to you. I'm telling you anyway, because I promised myself I wouldn't lie to you again, even about the parts of myself that aren't flattering." She found, to her own quiet surprise, that his honesty about the ugliness of his feelings disarmed her more completely than any smooth reassurance could have. There was something almost unbearably intimate about being wanted that fiercely, that nakedly, by a man who'd spent a decade learning to show nothing to anyone. The danger, meanwhile, didn't recede. If anything, it sharpened. Dante's intelligence confirmed that Rienzi's surveillance of Beatrice had continued and in recent days intensified. A man photographed loitering near the gallery twice in 1 week, a car that had followed her and Marco on 2 separate occasions before peeling away at the first sign it had been noticed. "He's testing our reaction," Luca explained one night, spreading a set of surveillance photos across his desk with the grim focus of a general reviewing a battlefield. "Seeing how closely we're watching her, how quickly we notice, how hard we'll push back. He's not ready to act yet. He's gathering information." "For what?" "For whatever plan he eventually decides gives him the best chance of using you against me without starting a war he can't win outright." Luca's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled. The voice Beatrice was beginning to understand that he used specifically to contain rage he couldn't afford to show. "I need you to trust me on something. And I need you to actually hear it instead of arguing on principle." For the next few weeks, I need you to let Marco and Enzo do their job completely. No slipping away for solo errands, no evening walks without one of them, nothing that gives Rienzi's people an opening. I know how much you hate feeling watched. I know it after everything you told me about growing up, feeling like you had to fight for every ounce of independence you built. I'm asking you to trust me anyway, because the alternative terrifies me in ways I don't have adequate words for. She thought about arguing, some stubborn, independent part of her rebelling instinctively against the idea of surrendering even a portion of the autonomy she'd fought so hard for. But she looked at his face, at the barely contained fear underneath the careful control, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this wasn't about ownership. It was about a man who had already lost her once, to circumstances beyond his control, and who was terrified, genuinely, bone-deep terrified, of losing her again to a danger he felt personally responsible for having introduced into her life. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll let them do their job." Relief moved through his expression, so visibly it nearly broke her heart. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, managing a small, tired smile. "You still owe me 9.5 years of missed birthdays to make up for. I intend to collect." He laughed, real, surprised, unguarded, and for a moment, despite the danger gathering at the edges of their careful reunion, it felt almost like enough. Rienzi's move, when it finally came, was elegant in its cruelty. Not a kidnapping, not the brute force leverage his organization had favored a generation ago, but something subtler and, in its own way, far more devastating. It arrived as an invitation, a benefit auction for the Metropolitan Museum's Conservation Department, an event Beatrix had attended professionally for years, entirely legitimate, entirely public, hosted by a board she had no reason to distrust. Rienzi's involvement was invisible. A donation made through one of his many legitimate holding companies, enough to secure him a seat on the host committee without raising a single flag, and enough, crucially, to guarantee Beatrice Hartwell, invited as a rising name in the restoration world, a specific table assignment he'd quietly arranged weeks in advance. Luca's security flagged the event as low risk. A museum benefit, heavily staffed, cameras everywhere, hundreds of witnesses, precisely the kind of public setting where violence was almost unthinkable, which was, Dante would realize too late, exactly the point. "I still don't love this," Luca said the evening of the benefit, watching Beatrice fasten an earring in the mirror of his townhouse's guest suite, where she'd taken to spending most nights in the weeks since Rienzi's surveillance had begun. "I'd rather you skip it. It's a museum fundraiser, Luca, not a nightclub in enemy territory. I need to be there. It's good for the gallery, and half the board already thinks I've gone strange and reclusive since the debt got resolved. I can't just disappear from every professional event because you're worried." "I'm always going to worry." He crossed the room, resting his hands on her shoulders, meeting her eyes in the mirror with an intensity that still, weeks into whatever they were rebuilding, made her breath catch. "Marco and Enzo will be there. I'll be 20 minutes away at a business dinner I genuinely can't reschedule. Call me the second anything feels wrong. Promise me." "I promise." The benefit unfolded, for the first 2 hours, exactly as any museum fundraiser should. Champagne, silent auction bids on restored antiquities, polite conversation with board members who complimented her recent work with a warmth that would have delighted her 3 months ago.
before an entire criminal underworld had reorganized her understanding of what warmth from strangers might actually cost. Marco stood at a discreet distance near the bar, Enzo near the main entrance, both exactly where they were supposed to be. It was during the live auction, in the crush of guests moving toward the ballroom's east wing for the evening's final lots, that Beatrice lost sight of both of them, separated by nothing more sinister than a crowd surge and a departing catering cart. 30 seconds of confusion that would, in hindsight, look almost suspiciously convenient. Miss Hartwell. A man appeared at her elbow, silver-haired, elegantly dressed, with the kind of easy, cultivated charm that immediately set something instinctive and wary humming beneath her skin. Salvatore Rienzi, I don't believe we've formally met, though I understand we have a significant mutual acquaintance. Her blood ran cold. I don't think I know that name. Come now. His smile didn't waver, didn't so much as flicker, and that composure frightened her more than open hostility would have. Let's not waste each other's time with pretense, Miss Hartwell. I know precisely who cleared your debts 3 months ago. I know precisely who's had 2 men shadowing you for the last several weeks. I know a great deal more about your relationship with Luca Moretti than I suspect you'd be comfortable with. He gestured, easily, toward a quieter alcove near the exhibition's east wall, away from the main crush of the crowd. Walk with me a moment. I promise you, this is not a conversation you want witnessed. I have nothing to say to you. I'm not asking for conversation. I'm delivering a message. And then I'll let you go entirely unmolested, back to your champagne and your silent auction. Something in his tone shifted just slightly, colder now beneath the charm. Refuse me, and I'll deliver the message somewhere considerably less comfortable for you. The choice is yours, Miss Hartwell, but I'd advise you to consider it carefully. Every instinct screamed at her to find Marco, to scream, to do anything except walk alone with this man into a quiet alcove away from the crowd. But some colder, more calculating part of her, the part that had spent 3 months learning to survive in Luca's world, understood that a public scene here, in front of 300 witnesses and cameras, was the safest possible version of whatever confrontation Rienzi intended. She walked with him. You have 30 seconds, she said, once they'd reached the relative privacy of the alcove, her heart hammering against her ribs. Say your message. Direct. I can see why he's drawn to you. Rienzi's smile had gone thin, purely functional now. Here is my message, Miss Hartwell, and I'd advise you to deliver it precisely. I have spent 2 years watching Luca Moretti build an empire I have every right to a share of, an empire his father took from mine 2 generations ago through methods I won't bore you with tonight. I have been patient. I have been civilized. I have tried repeatedly to negotiate terms that any reasonable man would accept. He has refused me at every turn because he believes himself untouchable. His eyes flicked over her, cold and assessing. You have taught me otherwise. Tell him I want 15% of his downtown holdings transferred quietly within 30 days, or I will begin taking my compensation through other means. Means that will involve you directly, Miss Hartwell, and won't be nearly so civilized as this conversation. Do you understand? Her mouth had gone completely dry. You're threatening me to get to him. I'm informing you of a business reality. Rienzi straightened his cuffs with unhurried precision.
Mr. Moretti made a critical error 3 months ago. He let the entire city see exactly what, or rather who, could break him. A mistake like that, in my line of work, is simply too valuable an opportunity to leave unexploited. Deliver my message. And Miss Hartwell. He paused, his smile returning, cold and terrible. Do consider, in the coming days, exactly how far a man like Luca Moretti will go to keep you breathing. I suspect the answer will surprise even you. He was gone before Marco, breathless and furious with himself, finally located her. 30 seconds too late to prevent the conversation, more than enough time to understand, from the ashen look on her face, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. 20 minutes later, Luca arrived at the museum at a speed that would have gotten a lesser driver arrested 3 times over, and the expression on his face when he found her, pale, shaking, alive but shattered in a way that went beyond simple fear, told her with absolute clarity exactly how far this war had just escalated. Luca did not raise his voice. That, Beatrice would come to understand over the following hours, was somehow worse than if he had. The terrible, contained stillness of a man whose fury had gone so far past the ordinary register of anger that it had come out the other side into something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Tell me everything he said," once they were back at the townhouse, once Dante and 3 other men she'd never met had assembled in the study with the grim efficiency of soldiers receiving a war briefing. "Every word, Beatrice. I need it exact." She told him. Rienzi's demand, the 15%, the 30-day deadline, the explicit threat woven through the cold civility of the delivery, and watched Luca's face grow more still with every sentence, the muscles along his jaw working, his hands flat on the desk in front of him, like he needed the physical anchor to keep from doing something he couldn't take back. "He touched you," Luca said finally, quietly, when she'd finished. "He put his hands on you at that alcove." "No, he didn't touch me. He just talked. It was somehow worse than if he had." "I understand." Luca's voice had gone very flat. Rienzi has always preferred the threat of violence to violence itself. It's more efficient. It costs him nothing and terrifies people just as thoroughly. He looked up, and the coldness in his eyes made her chest tighten. "I should have anticipated this. I told myself a museum benefit was safe because it was public, and I let that assumption cost you 30 seconds alone with a man capable of far worse than words. That's on me, Beatrice. That failure is entirely mine." "You can't watch me every second of every day, Luca. That's not a life either of us can survive." "Then I'll change the terms of the war instead." Something in his voice had shifted into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not the careful, controlled command he used in business, not the raw honesty of their private conversations, but something older and colder. The voice, she understood suddenly, of the man who had actually won a 2-year war for control of his family's empire against 3 separate rivals who'd underestimated him. "Dante, get me everything we have on Rienzi's operation, every warehouse, every shell company, every man on his payroll we've identified in 2 years of watching him. Tonight." "Boss, if we move on him directly, this stops being a quiet business conflict. This becomes—" "I know exactly what this becomes." Luca's voice was absolutely final. "He made that choice the moment he threatened Beatrice's life to extract concessions from me. I gave him 2 years of patience because I believed we could resolve this without bloodshed.
without disrupting the peace this city has enjoyed since I ended my own war for succession. That patience ends tonight.
Beatrice felt something cold settle in her stomach, watching this transformation unfold in real time. The man who'd knelt in front of her chair 3 months ago, offering a ledger of unsent letters with shaking hands, replaced now by something harder, more dangerous, a man capable of the violence his empire had been built on. Luca. She waited until he looked at her, until she had his full attention, despite the war council assembling around them. I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let this turn you into someone I don't recognize. I know what you are. I've known for months now. I'm not naive about the world you come from or what it demands of you. But I watched you tonight decide to go to war because of what happened to me. And I need you to understand that I don't want to be the reason you become someone crueler than you already have to be. If there's a way to end this that doesn't require becoming that man completely, I need you to find it, for both our sakes. Something in his expression softened, just slightly, the coldness fracturing to let something more human through. I'll try, he said quietly. I can't promise you clean hands, Beatrice, not in this world. Not against a man who's already shown he's willing to threaten your life to get what he wants. But I promise you I won't let this consume everything I've tried to become since I found you again. I won't let Rienzi turn me into someone who can't sit across from you afterward and still deserve to be there. It was, she understood, the most honest promise he could offer her. Not an absence of violence, which this world simply didn't allow, but a boundary around it, a line he intended to hold, even as everything around them prepared for war. The room emptied slowly over the following hour. Dante and the others dispatched to gather intelligence, to reinforce security at the gallery and the townhouse and her father's apartment, to begin the grim, methodical work of preparing for a conflict neither of them had wanted. When it was finally just the two of them, Luca sat beside her on the study's leather couch, exhaustion and fury and fear all warring visibly across his face, and pulled her into him with a desperation that spoke louder than anything he could have said. I almost lost you tonight, he said into her hair, his voice breaking slightly for the first time since the museum. 30 seconds, Beatrice. 30 seconds of a crowd surge, and a man like Rienzi had you alone, and I was 20 minutes away at a business dinner I should have cancelled the moment I felt uneasy about tonight. I keep doing the math on how much worse this could have gone, and I can't make myself stop. But it didn't go worse. I'm here. This time. He pulled back to look at her, and the fear in his eyes was raw and unguarded in a way she'd rarely seen from him. I've spent 10 years grieving you once already, Beatrice. I don't have it in me to survive doing it a second time. If Rienzi ever gets closer than 30 seconds, he won't, she said, with more certainty than she entirely felt, reaching up to hold his face in her hands. Because you're going to end this. And I'm going to trust you to end it in a way that leaves us both able to live with who you've become by the time it's over. I believe that about you, Luca. I need you to believe it too. He kissed her then, slow and desperate and grateful. A kiss that tasted like fear and relief and 10 years of longing. Finally, imperfectly colliding, and neither of them yet knew how close the coming days would bring them to losing everything they were only just beginning to rebuild. The next 5 days moved with the strange, suspended tension of a held breath. Luca's organization mobilizing quietly across the city, Rienzi's operation doing the same, both sides manoeuvring through boardrooms and back channels and coded conversations that Beatrice was allowed to witness only in fragments, enough to understand the shape of the danger without ever seeing its full extent.
She stayed, at Luca's insistence and her own reluctant agreement, almost entirely within the townhouse's fortified walls. Her father moved there as well, under protest, along with Sophia, who'd taken the news of Beatrice's Mafia entanglement with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination that had somehow made the whole surreal situation easier to bear. "I keep waiting to wake up," Sophia said one evening, the two of them curled on a window seat overlooking Central Park, while somewhere below, two of Luca's men conducted their hourly perimeter check. "3 months ago you were restoring a Flemish landscape and crying about rent. Now you're basically Mafia royalty hiding from a rival Don." "I'm not Mafia royalty. You're dating the head of one of the most powerful crime families on the East Coast, and you're currently living in a fortress with armed guards. I think that qualifies." Sophia's teasing softened into something more serious. "Are you scared?" Beatrice considered the question honestly. "Yes, but not the way you'd think. I'm not scared of Luca, or of who he is. I'm scared of losing him again, now that I've just gotten him back. That feels so much worse than any fear I have about Rienzi." It was on the 6th day, during what should have been a routine transfer, Beatrice travelling under heavy escort to the gallery to sign paperwork finalising the delivery of the restored Flemish landscape to its buyer, a transaction Luca's security had cleared as low risk given the short, direct route and the daylight hours, that Rienzi made his move. The ambush was efficient, professional, and utterly unlike the cold civility of his approach at the museum benefit. 2 vehicles boxed in Marco's car 3 blocks from the gallery, in broad daylight, on a street crowded enough that witnesses would later provide conflicting, half-useful accounts of a chaos that unfolded in less than 90 seconds. Marco reacted fast, faster than Rienzi's men had accounted for, pulling the car into a defensive manoeuvre that bought precious seconds. But the numbers were against them. 4 armed men to Marco's 1. And when the driver's side window shattered inward, Beatrice's scream was lost entirely beneath the sound of gunfire. Marco took a bullet to the shoulder, wrenching the wheel hard enough to clip the lead vehicle, and buy Beatrice the 2 seconds she needed to throw herself down below the dashboard. And it was that manoeuvre, desperate, instinctive, costly, that kept her alive long enough for the second car, the one trailing at a discreet distance that Luca had insisted on despite Beatrice's protests about excessive caution, to close the gap and put 3 of Luca's men between her and Rienzi's attackers before they could finish what they'd started. It was over in under 2 minutes. 2 of Rienzi's men lay wounded on the pavement. The other 2 fled in the surviving vehicle, disappearing into traffic before police could arrive. Marco, bleeding heavily but conscious, was rushed to a private physician Luca's organisation kept on permanent retainer, rather than a hospital where questions would follow that neither side wanted answered by law enforcement. Beatrice sat in the back of the second car, shaking so violently she could barely speak, glass fragments still glittering in her hair, and understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins exactly how close she had just come to dying. Luca reached the townhouse before she did, having received Dante's call within seconds of the first shots fired, and when the car finally pulled into the private garage, he was already there, wrenching the door open himself before the driver had fully stopped, pulling her out and into his arms with a desperation that bordered on violence. "I'm okay," she managed,
though her voice shook badly enough to undercut the claim entirely. "Luca, I'm okay. Marco got me down in time. I'm okay." He didn't let go. He held her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her back, his breathing ragged in a way she'd never heard from him, this man who'd maintained absolute composure through a Mafia war for succession, now visibly completely undone by the sight of her walking, alive, out of a car that had nearly become her coffin. "He shot at you," Luca said, his voice barely recognizable, stripped of every ounce of the controlled authority she'd come to associate with him. In broad daylight, on a public street, he had his men open fire on a car with you inside it. He crossed a line tonight that doesn't have a way back from it, Beatrice. Do you understand what that means? It means you're going to do something I'm going to be scared of, she said quietly, pulling back enough to look at his face, at the raw, unfiltered fury and terror warring there. Isn't it? It means Salvatore Rienzi just declared open war on my family by trying to murder the woman I love in the middle of a New York street. His hands framed her face, careful despite the violence radiating off him, checking for injuries with a tenderness that felt at complete odds with the coldness underneath. And I am going to end him for it, completely, tonight, if I can manage it. I am done being patient, Beatrice. I am done trying to find a version of this conflict that doesn't require becoming exactly the man you asked me not to become. He made that choice for both of us the second he put a bullet near your head. She should have argued. Some part of her, the part that had asked him days ago to hold a line against the worst of what his world demanded, knew she should have pushed back, reminded him of the promise he'd made. She didn't. She simply held on to him, shaking, alive, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the gunfire had, that in this moment, faced with the reality of how close she'd come to dying, she didn't want him to hold that line at all. She wanted Salvatore Rienzi gone, permanently, by whatever means necessary, and the wanting of it terrified her almost as much as the ambush itself had. Salvatore Rienzi had built his career on patience, on the careful, incremental accumulation of leverage that had allowed his organization to survive 2 years of losses to Moretti's superior resources without ever risking the kind of open conflict that had destroyed his father's operation a generation earlier. He had, in ordering the ambush, finally abandoned that patience, a calculated risk made in the belief that a demonstration of his willingness to escalate would force Luca Moretti to the negotiating table before matters spiraled further. It was, as it turned out, the single greatest miscalculation of his career. Luca did not negotiate. Within 6 hours of the ambush, 3 of Rienzi's primary lieutenants had been quietly, comprehensively removed from operation. Not killed, Luca had insisted to Dante with a controlled fury that brooked no argument, not yet, but isolated so completely that Rienzi's remaining infrastructure began collapsing under its own weight within a single night. Bank accounts frozen through channels Rienzi had no idea Moretti controlled. Warehouses raided by federal agents acting on tips that traced back, though Rienzi would never be able to prove it, to information Luca's organization had been quietly assembling for 2 years and had, until now, never used. Alliances Rienzi had spent a decade cultivating dissolved overnight as other families, watching the speed and precision of Moretti's response, decided with cold self-interest that backing Rienzi's collapsing position was no longer worth the risk. By the following evening, Salvatore Rienzi stood in the wreckage of an empire that had taken him 30 years to build, with perhaps 6 loyal men remaining and a federal investigation closing in from a direction he still didn't fully understand, and made the only decision left available to him. He requested a meeting. Luca agreed on one condition. The meeting would take place at a location of Luca's choosing, with terms of Luca's design, and Beatrice would be nowhere near it. "I don't like this," Dante said, the night before the meeting, watching Luca check the fit of a shoulder holster with the methodical calm of a man preparing for exactly the kind of violence he'd once hoped to leave behind entirely. "You don't need to do this in person. We have him cornered. Let the lawyers finish him. Let the feds finish him. You don't have to be in the same room as a man who tried to kill Beatrice." "I know I don't have to be." Luca's voice was quiet, final. "I want to be. He needs to look at my face when he understands exactly what he traded his entire life to get, and understand exactly why. This isn't about strategy anymore, Dante. This is about making sure he never, for 1 second, believes he can come near her again." The meeting took place in a warehouse Luca's organization owned in Red Hook, chosen, Beatrice would later understand, precisely because it held no sentimental value, no history, nothing but bare concrete and the cold, functional finality of a man conducting business he intended to close permanently. Rienzi arrived with 2 of his remaining men, visibly diminished from the composed, elegant figure who'd approached Beatrice at the museum benefit. His suit slightly wrong, his hands, when he extended one toward a handshake, Luca declined, not quite steady. "You've made your point," Rienzi said, without preamble, his voice carrying the particular brittleness of a proud man forced into supplication. "I'm prepared to withdraw entirely, cede my remaining territory, dissolve my organization, leave New York within the month. I'm asking in exchange for my life and the lives of the men who remain loyal to me." "You're asking for mercy," Luca said, his voice absolutely flat, "from the man whose woman you had shot at 3 days ago." "I never intended for her to be harmed. The car. My men exceeded their instructions. I wanted a demonstration, a message. Nothing more. You put 4 armed men around a car carrying a woman with no combat training and no way to defend herself, and you're telling me you didn't intend harm?" Luca's voice had gone dangerously quiet, and Beatrice, had she been there, would have recognized the tone immediately. The same flat, controlled register he'd used the night of the ambush, right before he'd sworn to end the man standing in front of him now. "I've spent 2 years extending you a courtesy you never earned, Rienzi, because I believed a war between our families would cost this city more than either of us could justify. That courtesy ended the moment your men opened fire on a public street with Beatrice Hartwell inside that vehicle. Do you understand what you actually did that afternoon? You didn't just threaten me. You threatened the one thing in this world I have never, not once in 10 years, been willing to lose twice." Rienzi's composure finally cracked entirely. "What do you want from me? Name it. I'll give you anything." "I want you gone." Luca's voice was final, absolute. "Not dead.
though God knows you've earned it, and every man in this room knows it too. Gone. You'll sign over every remaining asset to a holding company my lawyers will present you within the hour. You'll leave the country within 72 hours, and you will never set foot in New York again for the rest of your natural life. If I ever hear your name associated with any act of violence against anyone connected to me, Beatrice, her father, her friends, anyone, the mercy I'm extending you today will be the last mercy you ever receive from anyone. Do you understand these terms? Rienzi understood. He signed everything placed in front of him with hands that hadn't stopped shaking, and by midnight the following day, Salvatore Rienzi had boarded a private flight to a small villa outside Buenos Aires that would become, for the remainder of his life, both his exile and his prison. Alive, as Luca had promised, but stripped of everything that had once made him dangerous. Beatrice, waiting at the townhouse through the longest night of her life, watched Luca return just after 2 a.m., exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical, and understood from the particular quality of his exhaustion that he had held the line he'd promised her, that whatever violence this reckoning had demanded, he had contained it, in the end, to something he could still live with. "It's over," he said, pulling her into him with a relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. "He's gone. Really gone, Beatrice. You're safe." She held him for a long time in the quiet of the townhouse's entrance hall, 10 years and one devastating war finally, fully behind them, and let herself believe, for the first time since Positano, that safety might actually be possible for people like them. Spring arrived in New York with the particular, startling suddenness it always did. Cherry blossoms erupting overnight along Park Avenue, the grey months finally, mercifully breaking, and Beatrice Hartwell stood in the doorway of her gallery on a Saturday morning in April, watching the city wake up around her, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit. Uncomplicated happiness. Hartwell Fine Art Restoration had not simply survived the winter, it had flourished, buoyed by the Flemish landscape's triumphant unveiling at auction, which had fetched a price high enough to fully fund the gallery's next 2 years of operation without a cent of outside help. By a steady stream of new commissions from collectors who'd heard, through channels Beatrice suspected, but never confirmed traced back to Luca's discreet influence, about the exceptional young restorer in Chelsea. Her father, Walter, had moved back to the apartment above the gallery, his recovery from the stroke steadier now, his afternoons spent in the workshop, offering the kind of gentle, expert guidance that reminded Beatrice why she'd fallen in love with this work in the first place. Luca had not disappeared back into the careful distance he'd maintained for 10 years. If anything, the months since Rienzi's exile had drawn him closer, not with the possessive, fear-driven intensity of the war's immediate aftermath, but with something steadier, more patient. A man slowly, deliberately, building a life that had room in it for someone else's needs alongside his own, for the first time in a decade. He still ran an empire that dealt, in its shadowed corners, in violence and fear. That reality hadn't changed, and Beatrice had stopped pretending, even to herself, that it ever fully would. But she had watched him, over the winter, make choices that spoke of a man genuinely trying to reshape the edges of what he'd inherited, quietly withdrawing from 2 of the family's more brutal enterprises, expanding the legitimate real estate and foundation work until it comprised the clear majority of the organization's activity.
spending long hours with Dante, restructuring the family's operations towards something that looked, if not entirely legitimate, then at least considerably less bloody than what he'd inherited at 24. "You don't have to change everything for me," she told him one evening in March, watching him review documents at his desk with the particular focus he brought to any task he considered important. "I fell for who you are, not some sanitized version you think I'd prefer." "I know that." He set the papers down, giving her his full attention in the way he always did when a conversation mattered. "I'm not doing this for you, exactly, or not only for you. I spent 10 years building this empire because I believed it was the only version of strength available to me, the only way to survive a world that would have destroyed me otherwise. I'm starting to understand there might be other versions of strength I never let myself consider because I never had a reason to look for them. You're the reason I'm looking now. That's not the same as changing for you. It's closer to remembering who I might have become if my life had gone differently, and deciding I still have time to become some version of him." She thought often about the ledger, the 384 unsent letters, the decade of grief documented in careful, cramped handwriting, and about how strange it was that a stack of paper never delivered had become, in its own way, the truest map of the man she'd fallen in love with twice. Once as a boy, pretending to be ordinary, and once as a man who'd spent 10 years punishing himself for choices made out of love rather than cruelty. He proposed on a Tuesday, of all days, no elaborate spectacle, no audience, just the two of them, on the same cliffside path in Positano, where he'd once put himself between her and every edge, having flown her back for what she'd assumed was a simple, sentimental vacation. "I know this isn't traditional," he said, kneeling on the same worn stone path, the Mediterranean spread out, gold and endless, behind him, looking up at her with an expression that held none of the cold, calculated control he wore for the rest of the world, and all of the raw, unguarded honesty he'd once promised, on this exact path, that he would find a way to give her again someday. "I know I don't deserve the easy version of this, the version where I get to ask you this without 10 years of silence sitting between us. But I've spent every day since I found you again trying to earn back what I lost, and I don't want to spend one more day wondering whether you'll let me keep trying for the rest of both our lives. Beatrice Hartwell, will you marry me?" Not the boy who lied about being an economics student, and not the Don who built an empire out of grief. Just me. Whatever's left of both of us after everything. She said yes before he'd even finished the question, pulling him up into a kiss that tasted like salt air and 10 years of longing finally completely resolved. And somewhere in the golden light of a Positano evening, on the exact stretch of cliffside path where their story had first nearly ended, it began instead properly for the second and final time. They were married in September in a small ceremony at the Positano cliffside, overlooking the same water where they'd first fallen in love. No cameras, no press, a guest list small enough to fit in the villa's garden, curated with the particular care of two people who'd learned the hard way exactly how much danger visibility could invite into a life. Sophia stood as maid of honour, radiant and only slightly overwhelmed by the sheer, understated luxury of everything around her. Walter Hartwell walked his daughter down a path lined with white roses, his composure cracking only once, at the moment he placed her hand in Luca's, when he leaned in to whisper something, that made his new son-in-law's eyes go bright with unshed tears. A private exchange neither man ever repeated to anyone, though Beatrice suspected, from the way Luca held her hand a little tighter for the rest of the evening, that it had been some version of a father's blessing and some version of a warning, both delivered with equal love. Dante gave a toast that managed to be simultaneously the most sincere and the most alarming speech Beatrice had ever heard at a wedding. 9 years of loyalty distilled into a story about watching a cold, controlled young Don slowly, stubbornly become a man capable of kneeling in front of a woman with shaking hands and a ledger of unsent letters. And by the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye at the table, including, notably, his own. It was during the reception, as the evening deepened into the particular gold Positano light Beatrice had never stopped associating with the beginning of everything, that Luca pulled her aside to the edge of the garden, away from the music and the laughter, and pressed something into her hands. It was the ledger, the original, worn leather notebook with its 10 years of careful entries, but bound now alongside something new. 384 letters, actual letters, written out in full over the preceding months in the same careful handwriting she'd once watched sketch her portrait on a cafe napkin. He'd reconstructed them, she realized, turning through the pages with hands that had gone unsteady all over again. Not from memory exactly, since a decade had blurred some of the specifics, but from the truth underneath them, the 10 years of longing and grief and hope that had never actually needed the original words to be real. "I wanted you to have them properly," he said quietly, watching her read. "Not fragments in a ledger. The whole thing, the way it should have reached you the first time, if I'd been brave enough. I know it's 10 years too late. I know it doesn't undo any of the years we lost, but I wanted you to have proof, in your hands, that you were loved every single day of that silence, even when it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all." She read the first letter standing there in the garden, the September light fading toward evening, Luca watching her with the same raw vulnerability he'd shown her once before, kneeling by a fire with a ledger of burned confessions. It began the way the very first entry had, March 12th. "My father is dead 6 days, and I already don't recognize the man in the mirror," but continued now into everything he'd never let himself finish, a decade of love laid bare in full, unburned, delivered finally into the hands of the only person it had ever been meant for. "I'm going to need the rest of my life to read all of these properly," she said, her voice thick with tears, looking up at him with an expression that held 10 years of grief, finally, completely resolved into something that looked, unmistakably, like joy. "Good," he said, pulling her into him, into the warm gold light of the garden, into the sound of music and laughter drifting from the reception behind them. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wait for a single word from me again." They danced beneath string lights strung between olive trees, the same stars that had once burned close enough to fall into the sea, watching over them again. And somewhere, in the quiet, private architecture of that evening, no longer the boy who pretended to read books he wasn't reading, no longer the ghost who'd haunted a decade of unsent letters, simply a man and the woman he'd never, not for one single day, stopped loving. Luca Moretti finally, completely, came home. The letters never sent had become, in the end, the truest map of everything he'd felt and never said. And on a September evening in Positano, 10 years and one devastating war after it had all begun, Beatrice Hartwell held the whole of it in her hands at last. Every word, every year, every unbearable silence, finally, fully spoken. It was, she thought, watching Luca laugh at something Sophia said, his guard entirely down for perhaps the first time in a decade of holding everyone but her at careful, calculated distance. It was, finally, exactly enough.